Hello students, welcome to BTech 360. For years, the IIT tag has stood for certainty, strong placements, raising salaries and guaranteed outcomes. But when you step away from the headlines and study the data year after year, even at the IITs, a quieter and more uncomfortable reality begins to surface. Placement percentages are slipping. Median salaries are no longer moving in one direction. This is not about sensationalism or blaming institutions. It's about recognizing a structural shift in hiring, understanding what the numbers truly reflect. It is about helping students and parents prepare for a world where even the best brands no longer offer automatic assurance. Let me show you some data that you should all know to understand the placement reality at IITs. It's an uncomfortable truth, but a truth that you need to understand, a truth that you need to acknowledge, and a truth that you need to factor in when you're choosing your best colleges. So what I'm going to show you now is the placements at IIT, and through hard data, some uncomfortable truths that are emerging. And this is data, by the way, a year back, but this is the only publicly available data that's out there in the system, because this is data that's submitted to the government of India in 2025. But the data, obviously, it's not of 2025, it's of 2024. Just remember that. But still, it's a shift that you need to understand, because there seems to be some kind of a trend that is happening here. And before I start showing you the data, please subscribe to BTech 360 if you've not already done that. This will be very important for you. We're going to dig deeper into every single data point to help you get into the best college, the best course, the best pathway. So subscribe to BTech 360 if you've not already done that. Now coming back to the placements, you need to know data of what exactly is happening even at IITs. And for that, what we did was we looked at 23 IITs from the National Institutional Ranking Framework data, which is a NIRF data, which is submitted by these IITs to the Government of India for ranking purposes. So this is actually authentic data, correct data, signed on an affidavit and submitted by the IITs. Of course, remember, even all these submissions also would have some kind of a gray area if the person submitting data on the other side is looking for an outcome while not really delivering on the input. But having said that, of all the data that you have in the system, this seems to be more authentic data. And what is the data that we looked at? Of these 23 IITs, all the 23 IITs, we looked at the total intake of these IITs, the students that they admitted, the students who graduated from those that were admitted, and the students who placed after graduating. So we actually have all data. We looked at placement percentage from the intake against those graduated, and we also looked at median salary of all these 23 IITs. And the opt-out for higher studies. By the way, when you talked of opt-out for higher studies, what essentially happens is, while there will be some genuine students who actually opt out from the placement because they decide to pursue higher studies, there are far number of students who don't get good placement. And so what they do is say, because I don't have a good offer, let me move for higher studies. Because in engineering, most students, BTech, right? If it's an IIT, it's a different game altogether because they move for higher studies. But when you deal with BTech, and we notice this very, very clearly, good branches from good IITs do place 100%. Whereas when you keep coming down to the bottom of the ladder of the IITs and the not too good branches, when I say not too placement-centric branches, then you actually suddenly see more students opting for higher studies. So we also looked at that data. Now, what is the data that we're getting at? This is data, as I told you, submitted to the NIRF, which is National Institutional Ranking Framework, Ministry of Education, Government of India. So it is Government of India data is what I'm presenting. It is not my data or any personal data with any agenda. As I said, this is not about sensationalism. This is not about, blaming the institutions. But these are uncomfortable truths that you need to understand. What is the data that you have here? You actually have for UG 4 years, how many students was the, sanctioned intake, right? Year on year. How many students are there in 4 years? All the 4 years put together, first year, second year, third year. So for example, in this particular case, IIT Madras has 2,824 students, boys, 765 girls in all 3589 pursuing 4-year program. 5-year program, 1186 students are there. PG program, 1171 students are there. And PG 3-year program, 507 students are there. So this is the data that we have, and from there we have within the state, outside the country, EWS, all those data we have for. Now this is the data that we're trying to collate. This is as far as the number of students graduate, who are admitted, intake and all those kind of things. The next slide will tell you how the data is presented again in the same, this again, as I told you, this is submitted to the government of India, right? It talks of the total students intake in a particular year. Number of students, this is sanctioned intake, but actual admitted students is so much, right? How many students graduated in the minimum stipulated time, which is within 4 years, and how many students were placed. So in this particular case, if you notice that in 2018-19, the intake of IIT Madras is 488, of which only 414 were admitted. Of the 404 who were admitted, 388 graduated and 297 were placed. And then the median salary and the number of students who opted for higher studies is here, which is 78. And all this data we have for all the 23 IITs, and we're trying to compile that for your purpose. When we look at that data, this is what we found. We found that in 2025, the total number of students who were admitted was 13,032. The total number of placed students was 9,056, which is 69.51% from the actual students who were admitted. We're not getting into how many graduated and all. We just talk of how many were admitted and how many were placed. Now, in 2024, 11,083 students were admitted, 8,502 students were placed, which is 76.73. Now, you very clearly see here that there is a 7% drop in placement, right? There is a 7% drop in placement. You can very clearly see this, right? Now, the important thing that you must know is between 24 and 25, across these 23 IITs, the total number of seats that were increased was 1,949. Right, as a percentage is 17.59%. So 1,940, out close to 2,000 seats were increased by all these 23 IITs. But of these increased seats, only 554 were placed. By the way, I'm not saying that this is directly correlated. No, this is not directly correlated. This is just, I'm putting this as a number for you to understand that while the number of seats that were increased at IITs was about 2,000, close to 2,000, the number of students who were placed is about 550 only. The increase in placed students is 550, whereas the increase in number of seats who were admitted was close to 2,000. So when you look at that, only 28.42% of the students of the increase is what you could place. Now, again, I'm saying it's not from the same bunch of 1949 students, so I understand the mathematics part of it. But I'm just putting things in context at a macro level. This is not about drilling down this 1949, whether these 554, no, it is not that case. I'm not saying that. But of the total increased capacity that IITs have, the increase in placement, while the increase in capacity was 1949, the increased placement was only 554. That is alarming, which means that as they keep increasing numbers, the ability to place those students seems to be in question at this point in time. That's all we're trying to conclude here, right? So the placed students increased by 6.51%, whereas the increased capacity was 17.59%, which is what I'm saying here. 72% of the students who were, the increased capacity were not placed by the IITs also. And in all, the placement percentage fell down from 76% to 69% because of this problem that happened. Now we move further and try to understand what is it that, we talked of opt-outs, right? What we realize is simple, that the lesser the placement, the more the opt-outs from placement process. Why does it happen? Because when the offer is bad, when the offer is not comfortable, what the student does is they opt out of placement, or the institution claims that the student opted out of placement. They take a signature, and this has been a big pandemic that is swept across all institutions. They force students to opt out of placement process so that they can show a better number. It is all about vanity metric. It is not the truth as it will be, right? So, and when I showed you earlier how many, about 72% of the students are not getting placed. Now look at these numbers. I explained to you the problem of opt-outs, right? What we notice is whenever the placements drop, the students who are being pushed to go for opting out of placement process and opting for higher studies increases. There seems to be a direct correlation in this. And this is possibly because the student doesn't get a good offer, so they opt out. Or many a time, the institutions are forcing students to opt out of placement process because they can then show a higher placement metric. And this seems to be a direct correlation is what we realized. So what we looked at is when the placements fell, we wanted to understand what exactly happened. Have the students opted for higher studies? Because that is when the institutions will remove that from the placement process and then claim a higher percentage of placements from those who opted for placements by forcing students to opt out of placement process, which is what seemed to have happened here also. Like if you now look at numbers here, while in 24-25, about 10.23% students opted out of placement process, then in 25, 15.16% students opted out of a placement process. In 24, 11,083 was the admitted students and 1,165 students opted out of placement process. In 25, 13,032 students were admitted and 2,011 students were opting out of placements or opted for higher studies. When you look at that as a percentage, when about 2,000 students was the increase in intake, 846 students or half of that actually opted for higher studies. It's not the same correlation as I told you earlier also when we discussed of placement, but 45% of the increased intake actually went for higher studies or opted for higher studies. This again is alarming because your students percentage increased by 17.59% intake capacity, whereas the opting for higher studies increased by 72.62% or 73%. Now this again reflects very, very badly on IITs. There seems to be something very seriously wrong in terms of how they're pushing students and showing that data, pushing students out of placement process and showing that data as if they opted for higher studies. This may not be completely true, and that is an alarming number for me. So when we looked at this entire data, also the median salary, we talked of the fall in placement numbers and we talked of how the increased capacity is not going for placement and how almost 72% of the students are not being placed from the higher intake. You look at this number and this will tell you exactly where we are. The median salaries across all the IITs and not just of the increased capacity for all the students, all the, the numbers that we talked of earlier, which is about 13,000 students. So we're talking about 13,000 students. So when you looked at the data of all the 13,000 students, across all the 23 IITs, what essentially are we seeing? And this is an average of the median salary. The average of all the 23 IITs, median salary is what we're looking at. In 24, the average salary was 18.24 lakh. In 25, it is 16.24 lakh. The fall in median salary is 2 lakh across all IITs, and the fall is 11%. So the median salary across all IITs in 25 fell down by 11%. This is a big setback for all IITs because while they're not able to managing to place all the students, only a quarter of them are getting placed. But it also resulted in an 11% drop in the median salaries across the board. And this should shock every student who is looking at IITs and placements, because I started by saying that, we all assume a typical rise, which is what you'll read in newspapers, by the way. In newspapers, you'll only talk of how the 1 crore packages are coming and how more companies are coming for placement and how the best companies are coming for placement and so on and so forth, because those are press releases given by those IITs which are succeeding. But when you take the 23 IITs as a universe, this is what is reflecting. And this should shock everyone because you're actually seeing not just a placement drop in terms of percentages, but you're also seeing a placement drop in terms of the revenue, the median salary that is happening. So what essentially, if you go back to the first slide that I showed you, you look at this data, you actually saw the placement percentage drop by about 7%, 77% becoming 69%. So 7% drop in placement percentage, right? And I'm no longer now talking of increased capacity and those kind of things. So we actually saw a 7% drop in the placement percentage of IITs, and we're seeing an 11% drop in median salaries. 7% drop in placement percentage, and 11% drop in salaries. That is a report card for IITs for you in the year 25. And this, in my opinion, will continue with whatever claims, because the best IITs will come back and give you press releases. But this is something that you must know, that they actually saw a 7% drop in placement percentages and 11% drop in median salaries. And you need to understand this. So when you look at this as a summary between the last 3 years and look at the whole thing, this is what you'll realize, that the placement percentage from intake has fallen by about 7%. The placement percentage of graduated has fallen also by about 3%. The placement salaries has fallen dramatically, right? And the opting for higher studies has only increased. Now, all this should look at the data, because again I'm saying this is not about blaming the institution, these are not about sensationalism, but you need to understand the truth, the uncomfortable truth through hard data of what the IITs have, how the IITs have delivered over the last 1 year. Thank you so much. Namaskar.